Tonight's presentation is titled Fix It Now or Fix It Later, and our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He holds a certified flight instructor certificate. He's author for numerous aviation publications, holds an A&P certificate with the IA authorization. In 2008, he was honored as Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year by the FAA. Mike's a member of the EAA. Mike, it's good to have you back again this month. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Okay, well, let's get going. As Tim said, the title of tonight's webinar is Fix It Now and Fix It Later, or Fix It Now or Fix It Later. And what we're going to be talking about is how to decide how to deal with mechanical problems that come up with your airplane when you're away from home on a trip, like I am right now. For pilots, there is nothing more frustrating than having a mechanical problem on the road, because it's a really uncomfortable situation. You've got a broken airplane far away from your normal support system, your hangar, your toolbox, your trusted A&P mechanic. And in addition, these sorts of problems always seem somehow to happen at the worst possible time and place, on nights and weekends and holidays, when it's really hard to find any mechanics, in small uncontrolled airstrips where there's no services, and there's your time pressure to where you're going. And so it tends to be a very stressful situation for aircraft owners. And so when airplanes develop problems while you're away from home, it's natural to start thinking whether you really need to fix the problem now, or you can just live with it and it can wait until you get home. And there's a strong temptation to defer repairs until a more convenient time. And frankly, that's often a perfectly reasonable thing to do, except when it isn't. And we've all read NTSB accident reports that state that the probable cause of an accident was the pilot's decision to operate with a known mechanical deficiency. In other words, he knew there was something wrong with the airplane and he flew it anyway. So, do you fix it now or do you fix it later? That's what we're going to be talking about in the session tonight. Is fixing it now really necessary? Is fixing it later really safe? How do you decide what to do? Well, before you can make a decision about whether fixing something now is necessary or whether it can wait till you get home, you need to know exactly what's wrong. Unless you're confident that you know the cause of a problem in detail, you can't make an informed decision about how serious it is and whether it's safe to fly home with it. Now, sometimes the cause of a problem is obvious. You have a flat tire, you've got a broken radio, you have a burned out landing light, your attitude gyro is starting to make noise. Things that are very, very easy to diagnose. But sometimes the cause of a problem isn't so obvious. You know, there's a little oil mist on the windshield. Where's it coming from? Is that funny thing you smell, the odor of fuel in the cabin? Is the engine running rougher than usual, or am I imagining it? Is that dead number 3 EGT probe a non-firing cylinder or a broken wire? I had that problem on the flight up here to Spokane. My number 6 EGT on the right engine was starting to act up real badly. And I cross-checked a bunch of things and determined that it was an indication problem and not a real problem with the engine. And so I decided that it was not something that was going to cause to terminate the flight. And then lo and behold, about a third of the way through the flight, the probe seemed to fix itself and it worked fine for the rest of the flight. Go figure. Those are the things that can drive you absolutely crazy, but it happens. So in cases like this where the cause of the problem is not obvious, you need to investigate further. You need to do some troubleshooting, and you need to come up with a diagnosis before you can make a responsible decision whether to fix it or fly. Even small anomalies, things that seem really minor, are worth investigating. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that happened to me.
One night when I was flying home over the Arizona desert at night, and I heard some minor static in the comm radio. And I knew that that wasn't right, although it didn't seem like a big thing, but I decided to try to troubleshoot it a little bit. So I went through and turned each magneto off in turn. I fly a piston twin, so there's 4 magnetos, 2 on each engine. And when I got to the, I guess it was the right mag on the left engine, and I turned that mag off, the noise went away. When I turned off any of the other 3 mags, the noise didn't go away. So I had isolated it to a problem with the right mag on the left engine. After I landed, I pulled the top cowling off the engines and so I could take a look at the magneto. And lo and behold, what I found was the 4 nuts that hold the ignition harness onto the mag. A couple of them had backed off completely and the nuts were missing, and a couple of them were just barely hanging by a thread and were in the process of backing off completely. And one of the ones that backed off completely was also the nut where the shield of the P-lead for that mag got grounded, and that's why I was hearing noise in the radio. That was obviously a pretty serious problem, and it was a really good thing that I followed up on it. The symptoms seemed minor. Another thing that happened, flying a piston twin, and my engine nacelles have louvers on the top right above the engines, which is where the hot air from the accessory compartment comes out. And flying along, I saw a trickle of red liquid coming from the louvers. So where could that red liquid be coming from? Well, the only thing I could think of was that the propeller is full of red dyed oil, and it's full of red dyed oil, so that if there's a crack in the prop hub or something like that, it will show up. So I figured red liquid trickling back over the cowling was nothing to fool around with. And I made a precautionary landing at Redding, California, which was an airport that I knew had a very, very good prop shop on the field, American Propeller Service. And I called them up, and they came out to take a look at it. And sure enough, I had a major problem with the propeller, and the propeller had to come off and get repaired. Another time I was flying along, and there was a trickle of red liquid that was coming back over the cowling. And I had the same thought, and I was going to make a precautionary landing until I noticed that between the louvers where the red liquid was coming, all of a sudden a feather stuck out. And that told me what the problem was. Apparently I had ingested a bird into the engine compartment, and it got thoroughly fricasseed, and the red liquid was bird blood, and the feather, of course, was the tip-off as to what that problem was. So in that case, I wound up not making a precautionary landing, but having sort of a mess to clean up when I got home, because I had cooked bird stuck to a bunch of stuff in the back of the engine compartment. Anyway, the takeaway from all of this is don't fly with an anomalous symptom, even a seemingly innocuous one, unless you're satisfied you know what's causing it. Because only if you know what's causing it can you make an informed decision whether to fly now and fix later, or vice versa. You know, the red liquid was very ambiguous. In one case, it was coming from a prop hub and it was pretty serious. In another case, it was coming from a fried bird and it wasn't all that serious. So you need to investigate it until you know what the problem was. If a feather sticks out, that's a pretty good tip as to what the problem was. Tim, you're hearing me okay and seeing the slides okay?
Yep, loud and clear, Mike. I see your slides and I can
Excellent.
hear you just fine.
Okay. Anyway, moving on. Let's assume that you have gone ahead and diagnosed the cause of the problem. And you're pretty sure now that you know exactly what's wrong. Now, once you have the diagnosis, how do you decide whether it's safe to fly home? Well, that's a really hard question. Risk assessment questions are always difficult questions. I mean, if I asked you the question, is it safe to fly in this weather? I'm sure, different people in this group would have different answers, depending on the equipment they're flying, what their experience is, whether they're instrument rated, whether their airplane is equipped for flight in known icing. There's just a million things to consider when making risk assessment decisions, and everyone has their own level of risk tolerance. So when you're asking questions, is it safe to fly home this way, there really aren't any right answers. But I'll share with you a couple of things in my personal risk assessment handbook, if you will, and encourage you to think about this and come up with your own set of risk assessment rules for when things are safe to fly with and when they aren't safe to fly with. Personally, I am reluctant to fly with any significant problem that affects the engine, the propeller, landing gear, or primary flight controls. If there's a problem with engine, propeller, landing gear, or primary flight controls, I am pretty much spring-loaded to scrub the flight and deal with the problem. On the other hand, I'm usually okay flying with a mechanical problem if the aircraft has a backup for whatever it is that's failed. For example, my airplane has dual alternators. A lot of airplanes have dual alternators or backup alternators. So the failure of an alternator is not a no-go item for me. But if I only had one alternator, it would be a no-go item. Similarly, I have dual vacuum pumps. If I had a single vacuum pump and a vacuum-driven attitude gyro, a failure of either of those things would be a no-go item unless I had some sort of backup, like a backup electric gyro. If I have some way of keeping the dirty side down, then it's in my view safe to fly that way. So redundancy has a lot to do with it. Now, there are also some legal issues that we'll talk about in a minute. But as far as making the risk assessment decision of what's safe to fly with and what's not, those are some of the things I think about. On the other hand, we have dual magnetos on our engine, but I kind of draw the line there. I won't fly with a known bad magneto. And it's hard for me to defend that. Why would I fly with a bad vacuum pump if I had two of them, or a bad alternator if I had two of them, but not with a bad magneto, given that I have two of them? And I guess the answer is, it seems to me the consequences of having the other one fail are just too serious to accept when it comes to magnetos. I want to have two of them functioning. Now, I've known pilots that had bad magnetos and made the decision to go fly home in that condition and deal with it when they got home. And like I said, these are very personal decisions, so I can't really say, well, that was wrong. All I can say is, I probably wouldn't have done that if it was me. Personally, I consider my autopilot to be a no-go item for certain kinds of flights. If the flight is going to be an IMC, if the flight's going to be at night, or if the flight's going to be more than 2 hours long, I probably will scrub the flight if the autopilot's not working, because it's just hard to hand fly the airplane. You know, if there were put 2 pilots aboard, I might be a little more flexible about that. But those are the sorts of things that you just have to think about. Interestingly enough, when I took off from California this morning, flying up to Spokane, it's a 4.5-hour flight, I retracted the landing gear and I clicked on the autopilot, and the autopilot wouldn't come on. And it was like, oh my God, this is a 4.5-hour flight. Autopilot's not working. I was very tempted to scrub the flight. It's a long flight to hand fly. I thought about it. The weather was perfect. It was obviously severe, clear daylight. There were a lot of people waiting for me up here, and I made the decision that I was going to hand fly the airplane. And then inexplicably, about 30 minutes into the flight, the autopilot started working, and it worked for the whole rest of the flight. And I tested it on the ground here in Spokane. It worked fine. So it's just one of those weird things. But I had to go through a thought process, pretty serious thought process, of whether I was going to abort the flight because the autopilot was bad, just simply because it was a long flight. So those are the sorts of things we have to go through. Another thing you need to consider is this problem going to get worse? It may be a minor problem and you feel like it's safe to fly home that way, but are you sure that it isn't going to get significantly worse on the flight home? So you need to think about that. You know, if the gyro is noisy, is it possible that it's going to just quit dead some point on the way home? And if so, are you dealing with IMC or night where the gyro is really, really important? Will that slight smell of fuel that you think you smell in the cockpit stay slight, or is it something that's going to get worse? Will a stop drilled crack in a windshield stop the crack long enough for you to get home? That's an interesting one. I had a case some years ago. I was flying down to the Cayman Islands, and I had stopped overnight in New Orleans. And when I came out to the airplane the next morning, there was a giant crack in the pilot's side window, and changing that window out is a big deal, and it would have grounded the airplane for several days. And fortunately, I knew that there was a quick and dirty FAA-approved repair that's written right into Advisory Circular AC 43-131B, which it looks like this. You drill holes, little small tiny holes along both sides of the crack, and then you lace the crack together with safety wire. And that's an authorized repair. It looks like hell, I can tell you. And I was quite anxious to replace that window when I get home. But it got me to where I needed to go, and it got me home. And it only took maybe 30 minutes to effect the repair. Another time, I needed to go on a trip, and as I was pre-flighting the airplane, I discovered that one of my electrothermal Propty ice boots had come loose, and the end was flapping around. And I tried regluing it, and I just couldn't get it to hold. And I really needed to make this trip, and it was obviously I was going to need to buy a new boot and pull the old one off and redo the entire process. Putting them on is pretty tricky to get it right. So I improvised and put duct tape on the prop to hold the end of that boot on. And that looked terrible, and it's not an authorized repair. And the only reason I'm mentioning it to you is because I think the statute of limitations has run on it. but if I would hate to think of what would happen if I had gotten ramp checked with all that duct tape on my propeller. I would have had some serious explaining to do. After that happened and I got home, I discovered one day when I was down at Home Depot that they now make clear duct tape. And I bought a roll of clear duct tape, and I keep it in my wing lockers so that if I ever have to pull a stunt like this again, at least it will be semi-invisible. But at any rate, duct tape is kind of amazing stuff, and it will fix lots of stuff. You guys may have seen this. I found this on the internet. There's a quick and dirty fix flow chart that says if it moves and if it doesn't move and it should, you use WD-40, and if it does move and it shouldn't, you use duct tape. Let me point out that that's a joke in case we have any FAA folks in the audience, but it's kind of cute. Now let's talk just for a minute about the legalities of flying with something broken in the airplane. This is a pretty complicated subject, and in fact I did a whole webinar on it that's available in the EAA video archives. That was the title of it was "Is My Airplane Too Broken to Fly?" I won't go into great detail about this, but there's a very specific, moderately complex regulation that pilots really need to learn and understand about whether it's legal to fly with inoperative equipment. The regulation is FAR 91-213D, and it requires before you fly with inoperative equipment, you have to consider a list of things. First of all, you have to determine whether the equipment that is inoperative is required equipment for the airplane in the manufacturer's required equipment list, or in late model airplanes certified under Part 23, it's called a KOEL, a kinds of equipment list. It talks about what's required for IFR, what's required for VFR. But there's always a required equipment list or a KOEL, one of the two, in the pilot operating handbook. And so you need to determine whether the equipment that isn't working is required equipment on that list. If it is, you're not allowed to go with it inoperative. You're also required to determine whether the equipment that's broken is required by one of the 91-200 series regulations. 91-205 talks about what instruments and equipment are required for day VFR, night VFR, and IFR flight. It's the one that says you got to have position lights for night flight, and you've got to have certain instruments for instrument flight, and so on. So if it's something that's required by 91-105, you can't fly if it's broken. If you're conducting the kind of flight that it's required for. 91-207 talks about broken ELTs, when you're allowed to fly without a working ELT and when you're not. 91-209 talks about lighting and when that's required. Let's see, it also, and this doesn't come up very often, but you're also required to check whether the equipment that's broken is required to be operational by some airworthiness directive. I don't think I've ever come across that in real life, but it's a theoretical requirement, at least in the reg, and it must have come up sometime for some airplane. And finally, the FAA in this reg puts the monkey back on the pilot's shoulders and says it must be non-hazardous to fly with the inoperative equipment in the judgment of the pilot in command. So if you fly and something goes wrong, they will blame you because you made the decision and you were required by regulation to consider whether it was hazardous to fly with that inoperative equipment. But of course, that you need to do anyway. So that's kind of a quick summary of what 91-213D requires you to consider. At any rate, I just wanted to say a word about intermittents. Intermittents are the worst. They're really difficult. They never happen when you're trying to show them to a mechanic. So if you ask a mechanic to fix an intermittent problem and he can't duplicate it, which happens a lot, then the mechanic has no way of systematically troubleshooting the problem since he can't reproduce the problem. And so either he gives up and says, I can't fix it, which mechanics don't really like to do, or he is reduced to using guesswork, hoping to, trying replacing something or fixing something, hoping he gets lucky because he can't really diagnose the problem systematically. It's a process we call shotgunning, and it tends to be a very frustrating and very expensive for aircraft owners when mechanics shotgun. So unless an intermittent problem is life-threatening, like an intermittent loss of oil pressure or something, it's usually best to be patient with intermittent problems and wait till they get bad enough that you can show that the mechanic can actually reproduce the problem. If there are intermittents that happen, 10% of the time, then the chances of getting a mechanic who can actually reproduce the problem long enough to troubleshoot it is minimal. If it's a kind of a problem that we can wait until it gets worse, then we have a much better chance of being able to troubleshoot it systematically instead of having to use guesswork and try to shotgun the issue. So this is a case where fixing it later is often the best thing to do. But again, you need to make a judgment as to whether the intermittent problem is sufficiently hazardous that it's unsafe to fly with it. If it is not hazardous enough to make it unsafe to fly, then it often it makes sense to continue to fly and hope that the problem gets worse so they can be troubleshot. So let me just sort of wrap up some of the takeaways here. When you have problems away from home, you have to investigate them enough that you feel that you know exactly what's wrong before you make a decision whether to fix it now or fly home and fix it later. Even seemingly minor anomalies can be clues to major problems. We talked about the radio noise. We talked about the little trickle of red liquid on the cowling. So when you do see anomalies, even if they seem minor, they are worth investigating until you find out what causes them. Then you can make an informed decision as to what to do. Once you're confident that you know exactly what's wrong, then you have to make the decision as to whether it's both safe and legal to fly. Safe is a subjective decision that you make based on your risk tolerance. Legal is a decision that you make based on the flow chart, basically, that's in FAR 91213D. Before deciding to defer maintenance, ask yourself if you're confident that the problem won't get too much worse before you get home. Consider making temporary quick fix while you're away from home that will get you home safely, like the laced up window. I'm not going to advocate the duct tape on the prop because that really is not an approved repair, but you get the idea. For intermittent problems, if you determine that the intermittent problem is not a safety of flight issue, the wisest course, as we just said, is often to be patient, fly home, wait for the problem to get worse enough that you can your mechanic can reproduce it, or if you're doing your own maintenance, that you can reproduce it. Because if you can't reproduce a problem in the maintenance hangar, then you're reduced to guesswork, and that's always a very expensive, very frustrating way to go. Talk a little bit about FAR 91.7. That's the basic civil airworthiness rule. It says, I'm quoting the entire reg here because it's a very short reg. No person may operate a civil aircraft unless it's in airworthy condition. The pilot in command of a civil aircraft is responsible for determining whether that aircraft is in condition for safe flight. The pilot in command shall discontinue the flight when unairworthy mechanical, electrical, or structural conditions occur. The reason I put this reg up, and the reason I highlighted the phrase pilot in command twice in that reg, is to underscore the notion that it is the decision of the pilot in command, not of a mechanic, to determine if the airplane is airworthy and in condition for safe flight. And that is true 364 days out of the year. One day out of the year, the regulations require us to get a mechanic of some sort or somebody with a suitable repairman certificate to do an annual inspection, a condition inspection, whatever is appropriate for the kind of airplane involved. So we basically need a professional judgment call on the condition of the airplane one day a year. 364 days a year, it's the pilot in command that makes the call as to whether an aircraft is airworthy and in condition for safe flight. And there's a lot of confusion about that, but it is squarely, the regs put it squarely on the shoulders of the pilot in command to make that determination. So with that, and with all the technical incitement we had tonight, Tim, I don't know how much time we have left for Q&A, but I'm here if you have questions.
All right, well, good, and we can hear you just fine.
I feel a little bit shell-shocked with everything that's happened here, but hopefully, hopefully it wasn't too agonizing an experience for everybody, and I apologize for the problems. We've never run into these problems before in any of the webinars we've done, so we've done about 60 of them now, probably. So
yeah,
this one will be memorable.
It will be memorable. I've had a number of comments from people in here, and I know one person said, we'll look back on this and laugh about it. Donald says, this follows the path of how an accident develops. Good object lesson.
Yeah.
Just one thing after the next. So maybe we could have one or two things else go wrong in the next 21 minutes here, and then at the very end will just be the smoking hole.
This is an accident chain that we just experienced.
Okay, well, let's go to a question here. Roger says, I diagnosed a malfunctioning alternator at the beginning of a cross-country flight, and I decided I would continue the 400 miles to my destination with limited electrical system usage for the duration. I landed at my intended destination with a dead alternator, believing the safety of my flight were in jeopardy. Was this a bad decision, you think?
Well, it's an interesting question. As I said, there are two ways you can look at questions like this. One is the safety issue, which is really a subjective decision that each of us have to make, and the other is a legal issue, which is the 91-213D issue. I don't know if this was a certificated airplane or whether this was an EAB. If it was a certificated airplane, I would guess that the alternator is probably on the required equipment list, and it probably was technically illegal to fly with a known inoperative alternator. If it was an EAB, I don't think the rules are very clear about that. I don't think you have a required equipment list and stuff. It's a little complicated. I can't criticize anyone's decision to do something like that on a safety basis because each of us have to make our own risk management decisions. And of course, the questioner didn't indicate, whether this was a flight in daytime CAVU or whether it was a flight in instrument conditions. That would have a big bearing on how critical it would be to have a functioning electrical system. But the one thing that would trouble me if this was a certificated airplane is that I think there's a very high likelihood that the alternator was on the required equipment list in the POH. And if it was, then it was a violation of 91213D to fly with the inoperative alternator. And you know, if you got ramp checked, you could get in trouble for doing something like that.
So it sounds like if that's the case, if it was a type certificated aircraft that the alternator failure was on, he should have done a 180 and returned back to home base or the nearest airport?
Well, that's a little unclear. The 91213D generally tends to deal with departing with known inoperative instruments or equipment. It's kind of a different issue if the equipment becomes inoperative during the flight. If it becomes inoperative during the flight, then I believe it's the second paragraph of 91.7 that really governs, and that says that the pilot shall discontinue the flight when unsafe condition occurs. So that reg gives the pilot the responsibility for making a safe to fly decision to decide whether to discontinue the flight. 91213D, which talks about whether you can take off with inoperative equipment, also, of course, requires the pilot to make a determination as to whether the lack of the equipment is going to be hazardous, but it also gives a bunch of objective tests, like, is this on the required equipment list? Is this required by one of the 91200 regs, and so on. So if it failed in flight, it's a little bit different than if it failed and then there was a decision whether to go fly with a known pad alternator to fly home, say.
Okay, question here from John. He's wondering, where there are multiple pilots, how do you share knowledge between the pilot who discovers a problem, and subsequent pilots?
Well, that's a big issue, and typically flying clubs. I'm involved in a lawsuit right now involving the United States Air Force Aero Club at Elgin Air Force Base. But operations of that sort, where multiple pilots fly the airplane, typically have some sort of standard operating procedure for writing up squawks in a known place and keeping the squawk list, you know, in the glove compartment, someplace where the next pilot can find it. There's nothing in the regulations, to my knowledge, that ever talks about this particular issue. I think it's strictly a matter of the standard operating procedures established by whoever is operating the aircraft. I don't think the FARs have anything to say about writing up squawks so that the next pilot is aware of them. It's a good question.
Yeah, and Jerry's wondering, hey, Mike, what are you going to do about your autopilot that didn't work and then did work?
Well, that's a really good question. Because I've got to fly the airplane home on Sunday. I've got to fly it down to Southern California on the following Saturday, and then I got to fly it all the way to Pensacola, Florida the following week. So I'm going to watch it very carefully is what I'm going to do. I've had this airplane for a very long time. It turns out that I've had it for 29 years. And I've had a couple of cases in which the autopilot would not turn on. And in every case in the past, it's been a problem that would not fix itself. Like it typically is a bad power supply board in the autopilot computer. But a bad power supply board doesn't fix itself. So this is a unique problem. It's something that I've never experienced in 29 years. A problem where the autopilot would not engage, and then 30 minutes later it suddenly started working. That's a very difficult kind of problem to deal with. And you can imagine if I took the airplane into the avionics shop, it's dollars to donuts that it would work perfectly when the avionics tech tried it. And so now, what's he faced with? He's faced with changing out very, very expensive autopilot components to hoping to get lucky. We don't want to get into a situation like that. So this is the kind of thing I was talking about. Intermittents are very difficult. Mm-hmm. And what I'm going to do is watch it very closely and see what happens. See if it fails again or not. I might just, in an abundance of caution, go back and reseat the autopilot computer to make sure that the connectors, making good contact and everything. Try whatever simple things I can try. But I hate this sort of failure because it's so difficult.
Okay, question here from Enthusiast wondering, he said, I lost a quarter-turn fastener on a Warrior cowl latch and repaired with duct tape to hold it latched to get home. A 1 hour at night under visual meteorological conditions. Still solid when I got home, but occasionally I wondered if this was a legal temporary repair. Statute of limitations has run out on this also, he says, but was this legal?
Well, I am not aware of any advisory circulars that authorize the use of duct tape for any sort of structural repairs. I have to tell you, I personally don't have any problem with that, and if I were in this situation, I would very seriously consider doing the same thing.
That's where that clear duct tape might be kind of nice, huh? It doesn't stick out as much.
Yeah, the clear duct tape definitely is the way to go for stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, Elmer says, I predict it's going to be a beautiful VFR day, so Mike, enjoy a good day VFR filed flight and enjoy your hand flying skills.
Well, for sure, flying the airplane 4.5 hours by hand is a character building experience, and I'm not opposed to character building experiences. I mean, I sort of hope that isn't necessary, but if it's going to be a day flight, and I don't know if it's going to be VFR yet, we'll have to see. But I'll just have to make my decision.
Patrick has a question here. He says, I noticed a kink in the fuel line to the carburetor that was not there before I brought it in for its annual inspection. During the annual, fuel lines were changed. The plane flies the same. What should I do? Should I continue with it or have the kink changed? He says the kink is sharp.
Well, I mean, I would be happier if I saw a picture of what was going on, but just from the description, I absolutely would get the problem solved. I'm not going to take the position that you should ground the airplane and not fly it until the problem's fixed, but I would fix it at the earliest opportunity. I take it that this is a rigid fuel line. It got kinked, and a kink is a stress riser, and if the tube fatigued and broke apart, that would be an extremely serious issue. Not only could it cause an engine failure, but it could cause a in-flight fire, which is kind of the worst thing that can happen to you. So yeah, I would not just live with it. I would get it resolved, put a new line in there, and hopefully the mechanic that installed the line and let it get kinked is going to help out with the cost doing that, I hope.
Okay, we got a little comment here from Paul Schuck, who does some webinars for us every other month, who is very familiar with special light sport aircraft. And he just wanted to say that special light sport aircraft usually have no KOEL. So what you have to do is contact the manufacturer for verbal authorization to fly with any failed equipment.
That seems, well, that seems pretty impractical, doesn't it? If you have a problem, to be grounded until you call the manufacturer. And I actually, I don't know if it's legal to give a plug, but my next month's article in AOPA Pilot Magazine is about light sport aircraft maintenance rules, which bother me a great deal. And I won't say any more than that, but it's an article that discusses the difference between LSA maintenance rules, EAB maintenance rules, and normal category certificated aircraft maintenance rules. And I'm personally very, very uncomfortable with the way that LSA maintenance rules came out. So.
Yeah, they're very different than standard category, that's for sure. So I'm sure your article will be very informative to folks, because there's a lot of misunderstanding even amongst the, well, especially amongst a lot of the maintenance community, because the SLSA maintenance rules are so different, and they're still new. I mean, it's only a 11-year-old rule now, so a lot of people just don't understand it.
The FAA basically just put all the responsibility that the FAA usually has on the manufacturers, and made the manufacturers word law, in effect. And that makes me very uncomfortable, because in my experience, I would much rather be, if I have to be regulated at all, I'd much rather be regulated by the FAA than by the aircraft manufacturer. But I talk about that at some length in the article.
Interesting. Next month, AOPA Pilot Magazine, it sounds like, huh?
Yeah, I think it's the April issue.
April issue. Cool. All right, well, maybe pick that up at Sun and Fun. Are you going to be down at Sun and Fun, Mike?
I will not be at Sun and Fun now.
Okay. Okay, a question here from Roy. Mike, the fuel pressure gauge in my old Musketeer has recently been showing up to 10 psi, i.e. above the green range, even with the electric boost pump switched off. This is an intermittent problem now, but could this become an unsafe condition?
Well, the first thing you need to determine is whether it's an indication problem or a real problem. In other words, whether the gauge is lying to you or not. So the first step is to plumb a different gauge, a calibrated gauge into the system, measure your actual fuel pressure, and see whether the indications on the cockpit gauge are accurate or not. If they are accurate and you are getting bad fuel pressure regulation, then you need to look into that. This is a Beach Musketeer?
Yes.
And I don't know if this was, if we're talking about one with an injected engine or one with a carbureted engine, but if it's an injected engine, the RSA fuel servo that those airplanes use is pretty complicated, and it might have a problem.
You said 10 psi. I don't know if that would make a difference. You know, it's reading right now, which is above the green arc.
Mm-hmm.
Just a comment here from Peter. He said, a passenger holding an ATP and myself took off in our aircraft and noticed our throttle control was loose and the engine's idle speed was higher than normal. We noticed the looseness while transitioning from cruise to climb. We decided to continue to our destination. However, the aircraft is now stuck there, and we are back at home due to a broken bracket connecting the throttle cable to a mount in the engine compartment. Listening to your webinar has me realizing we probably should have taken it to the shop rather than the destination. Thanks for your lesson.
Yeah, well, or at very least, uncowled it and tried to, have one guy move the throttle and the other guy look and see what's going on inside. You don't necessarily need to be a mechanic to figure stuff like that out. You have to be a mechanic to fix it, but a lot of this stuff, pilots can diagnose themselves, and I encourage them to do that. And again, at the end of the day, the regulations put the responsibility for making that determination squarely on the shoulders of the PIC.
Yeah. Well, we've had a number of questions about the video on this, and I'll do my very best, folks, to edit the video that gets posted online to kind of remove all that dead time in there to try and clean it up to make it a more enjoyable experience when you go back and watch it online. So hopefully I'll have that done tomorrow and posted to the EAA video player sometime tomorrow. Looks like we're about up to the end of our time here, Mike. I just want to thank you very much for persevering through your issues there. I know that gets a little stressful, and it's kind of hard to figure out, well, what should I be doing? What's the next step? But you did a masterful job coming back on and finishing up the program here. Thank you very much for sticking it through. And
Did it sound okay on the phone?
Actually, you sound great. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, Tim, if you go to try to edit the video and you decide that it's sort of beyond hope, let me know, and I could try to find some time to regenerate the video portion that's other than the Q&A or something. But hopefully you'll be able to rationalize it. I know it's going to be a lot of work for you, and I'm sorry you have to go through that.
Roger that. Not a problem. Not a problem at all. Please just take a few moments and share any closing comments you'd like.
Okay. Well, first of all, my email address is up on the screen, so if anybody has any issues that either you didn't get a chance to ask tonight or you didn't ask tonight in public because the statute hadn't run yet, feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to them for you. These are the upcoming webinars. In April, we're doing one called Watch Your Language, which talks about terminology that owners use with mechanics and how the choice of words can make a really big difference in the cost of maintenance. May 4th, we're going to do the Lost Art of Repair. That was actually the webinar I think that we had scheduled for March, and I wound up getting ill and had to cancel it at the last minute, for which I apologize. But so we've rescheduled it. And June 1, we're going to do the first of a series of webinars on piston aircraft engine combustion theory and some things like that, and the June 1 webinar is entitled Suck, Squeeze, Bang, Blow, which are slang for the 4 cycles of an Otto cycle engine. So those are the next 3 webinars coming up, and if you haven't done so, I would encourage you to sign up for my free monthly newsletter, in which we've got all sorts of interesting maintenance-related stuff. It comes out every month. You can either do that on the post-webinar survey that Tim's going to put up by checking a checkbox, or you can go to the SavvyAviator.com website and sign up there for the newsletter. And every copy of the newsletter has an unsubscribe link, so if you wind up getting subscriber remorse, you can always take yourself back off the list. And finally, if you haven't seen it already, check out my book. It's called Manifesto, available on Amazon for about $12. And if you Google Mike Bush Manifesto, it will take you right to the Amazon page. So that's about it, Tim. And sorry for all the excitement tonight, but this is probably a good webinar for that to happen, because somehow the two things just blended together real well.
They really did. Yep, they sure did. Again, thank you.
Mechanicals on the road.
Oh man,
they don't only happen to airplanes.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, I'm looking forward to June 1st. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow. That sounds like an awesome presentation. You know, the theory of how the engine works, though, seriously, that's going to be neat stuff. I'm looking forward to that one. So that's neat. Thank you so much for putting that into the schedule. Hey folks, thank you all for sticking with us tonight, and there's still 330 of you out there. You know, I know we had our technical difficulties tonight. Thank you so much for sticking with us to work our way through them to actually reach the end here of the presentation. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Have a great night, everybody, and hope to see you next week when Jim Parker is talking about flying your own plane to Cuba. Have a great night, everybody.
That sounds like one I'm going to want to hear. So thank you very much, everybody, for your endurance, and we'll see you next month.